This episode is brought to you by Manscaped. I know, I'm as surprised as you. Manscaped makes a full range of grooming products for men, specially designed to keep your nethers smooth and presentable. They sent me their latest below-the-waist trimmer, the Lawnmower 5.0, and without going into too much detail, it's great. It's waterproof, so you can use it in the shower if you want. It's got an LED light so you can see what you're doing, which sounds silly until you really get in there and find out that's a great idea. The specially designed screen guards gives you a close, smooth finish while minimizing cuts and abrasions. And if you're not looking for the cue balls look, the lawnmower comes with a set of combs or guards to get exactly the length of trim you're looking for. I was especially impressed with those, as they are designed very cleverly so that 3 combs can produce 7 different trim levels, depending on the angle you hold the trimmer. And as someone who was always losing accessories for everything, having less to keep track of is really great. Manscaped also has a range of other grooming products, from beard trimmers to just regular old razors, along with creams and aftershaves to make sure you feel fresh and your skin feels pampered. They also sent me their nose hair trimmer, and that's great too. Fits nicely in the hand, does its job quickly, cleanly, without tugging or discomfort. Now, you're all seasoned podcast listeners, I know. So, I know you're also waiting for the discount code, and here it is. Go to manscaped.com and enter the code DARKAGES at checkout to get 20% off and free shipping. That's 20% off plus free shipping when you use the code DARKAGES, DARKAGES, at manscaped.com at checkout. For the best your boys have ever looked, trust Manscaped. Hello, and welcome to the Dark Ages podcast, episode 47, Roman Hispania. Welcome back, everybody. I am sorry about the interruption in service. There have been a lot of things happening IRL that have made it difficult to focus on putting out podcast episodes, and to be honest, reading back over older episodes, I realized that I had lost some spark. I wasn't having as much fun doing them, and it was starting to show. I didn't want to put all the time into producing episodes that weren't as good as I wanted them to be, or as good as you'd all deserve. So it was time to take a break and have a think. I also reached the end of a batch of sources, and so I had to catch up reading. But now I'm back, and let me offer a very heartfelt thank you to all of you who left comments or sent emails while I was gone. Your support and patience have been amazing, and an important motivation for me to work hard on coming back. So thanks to each and every one of you. In this little one-seater plane of an operation, you are literally the wind beneath my wings. I could not do what I do without your support, and I'm deeply and forever grateful. Okay, let's all check our insulin levels and get back into the swing of things. We're going to be switching gears. For quite a while, we have been focused pretty intensely on Belisarius and the wars in Africa, and especially on Italy. And that means that our focus has been relatively narrow, focused on Ostrogoths and Byzantines. Important, of course, but it means we've kind of lost sight of the rest of the Mediterranean and the greater European world. So I'm going to be switching the focus westward, away from Italy to Spain, and to the Ostrogoths' cousins, the Visigoths. We're going to be spending the next few episodes talking about the Visigoths and how they transitioned from a kingdom centered on Toulouse in southern Gaul to a kingdom very firmly associated with Spain and Portugal. I may have mentioned it before, but a while back I went to see Mike Duncan speak in the back room of a coffee house in Milwaukee. If you're a fan, you may remember him announcing that event as the first of a run of personal appearances he was making. As a very small part of that presentation, he had a couple of words about principles that guided his writing, namely, every sentence is about one thing, every paragraph is about one thing, and every episode is about one thing. Now, try as I might, I cannot seem to master that last piece of advice, and in order to set the stage for the Visigothic kingdom and the precursor Suevic kingdom while we're at it, this episode is about 3 things. First, I'll talk about the history and development of Roman Hispania. What are we starting with, and how did we get there? How was it organized, and what did it produce? I feel like I could have done a better job of this kind of thing in the past episodes about both Italy and Gaul, so I'm aiming to correct that going forward. Nested inside there is some information that I've turned up that isn't strictly relevant to the story of the Visigothic kingdom, but it's the kind of thing I stumbled across that you can't possibly leave unshared. Second, I'll review a little bit of the history we've already covered as it applies to the region, namely the upheavals of the 5th century, up until the Visigoths were contracted to clear out the other barbarian tribes that were making trouble. Third, I will briefly talk about the sources we'll be leaning on for all of this. There aren't many. There is no Priscus or Procopius around to give us a ground-level tour, and so reconstructing the chronology and narrative of the Visigothic kingdom is tougher than the Ostrogothic kingdom was. But before we really get going, quick note on geographical nomenclature. The temptation is to just say Spain and be done with it, but that leaves out Portugal, and since there was no distinction between the two territories for quite some time, that won't do. The Romans called the whole region from the Pyrenees to Gibraltar Hispania, and then divided it into smaller provinces, which we'll get to in a minute. So Hispania is the word I'm going to be using the most often going forward. All of it sits on what's known as the Iberian Peninsula, or Iberia, so I will probably use that as well, though the presence of Caucasian Iberia, way over at the eastern end of the Black Sea, may cause some confusion for some. But how about I just promise that for the rest of this series, at least, I will never again refer to that other Iberia, okay? As far as other place names, I'll keep it my usual practice of using the modern name for cities and settlements, unless it doesn't make sense to do so for some reason. I do that for clarity, so that if you wanted, you can follow along on a modern map and not have to constantly Google the Roman place names of things, just to find out, oh, he just meant Barcelona. The Roman presence in the Iberian Peninsula began when they defeated Carthage in the Second Punic War in 206 BC, but it took 200 years of brutal, frustrating, and often poorly recorded fighting to extend control over the whole region. The middle of the peninsula is mostly made up of a highland plateau surrounded and cut across by mountains, with the highest and most rugged of these being the Cantabrian Mountains along the north coast, a continuation of the Pyrenees. The geography meant that the interior was a patchwork of Celtic, Aquitanian, and older Iberian tribes, many of whom were fiercely hostile to Roman domination. Among these are the Vascones, the ancestors of today's Basques, who, like the Isaurians in the Eastern Empire, were barely ever Romanized and will pop up from time to time as a thorn in the side of various rulers as we move forward. The Spanish campaigns were convoluted and often effectively were counterinsurgencies, with all the kinds of atrocities that kind of war tends to produce. A couple of famous names made their bones fighting the Hispanian tribes, among them Cato the Elder, a few Scipios, and Tiberius Gracchus, the father of the famous Gracchi brothers. Roman control was established first along the coast of what we now call Catalonia in the northeast, and extended gradually down the Mediterranean coast and up the Ebro Valley before any substantial gains were made in the interior. It was only with the subjugation of the Cantabri tribe in 19 BCE, during the reign of Augustus, that the entire region could be called Roman. Even after this nominal conquest, the Iberian interior would be a source of uprisings and unrest for another century, particularly in the north, and Romanization was gradual and uneven. The greatest concentration of Roman coloniae were in the Ebro Valley in the northeast, along the eastern coastline, and in the Andalusian plain in the southwest. The central and northern regions, more mountainous and less fertile, were slower to adopt Roman character. Much like the Gallo-Roman culture and identity that developed further north, a Hispano-Roman identity developed with identification with Roman ideals and culture more pronounced at the top of the social scale, and a more localized popular culture among the less wealthy or connected. In spite of the violence of Hispania's annexation, by the time the Goths crossed the Danube, where we started our story, the region had been strongly integrated into the Roman system for over 350 years. Time and distance from the frontiers had made Hispania one of the safest, richest, and most Romanized parts of the empire. In material terms, the Romanization took all the forms we're familiar with: bathhouses, theaters, arenas, aqueducts, etc., etc., etc. Urban life was as important in Hispania as it was anywhere else in the empire, with some of the major centers being Tarragona, Mérida, Cartagena, and near Seville. It had its own Hispano-Roman flavor, just as the culture of Gaul had its own flavor, but it was no less Roman for that. Initially, the region was divided into 3 large provinces, but in 298 these were reorganized into 5 as part of Diocletian's reforms. These 5 would persist until the fall of the empire and beyond, so we may as well go through them. They were Tarraconensis in the northeast, including the Ebro Basin and most of the mountain passes into Gaul. Carthaginensis, the largest, in the east and center, and including Valencia, Castile, La Mancha, and chunks of several other modern provinces. Galicia was in the northwest and the most mountainous, and containing both the current Spanish province of Galicia, but also about the northern third of Portugal and a sizable chunk of Leon. Lusitania in the west was pretty much the rest of Portugal plus a chunk of Extremadura, and Baetica in the far south, mapping roughly onto modern Andalusia. Acquisition of resources had driven the Roman conquest, and in turn Hispania became a major economic supporter of Rome's further conquests. The mines of the region were legendarily productive, and remained so throughout the Roman period. Gold, iron, silver, and copper were the most important, but lead, zinc, and mercury were also pulled from the ground in significant amounts. The mines, worked almost entirely by slaves, were owned by the state and administered mainly by equestrian families who became enormously wealthy in the process. And this is where we reach some of that information that just cannot be kept to oneself, and that has to do with the techniques of ancient mining. Again, not strictly germane to our subject, but, well, just wait. Various mining techniques had been developed since the Bronze Age, and it shouldn't surprise anyone that the Roman engineers developed advanced strategies for massive extraction of ore. The oldest method of mining gold is placer mining. That's simply panning gold from alluvial deposits in rivers and streams. Logically, that gold had to come from somewhere, and it didn't take long for people to recognize that it must have come from upstream in the mountains. The larger deposits gave birth to the smaller bits that were washed down, and are thus called mother lodes. That's where that comes from. And the Romans developed an absolutely mind-blowing technique for exposing the mother lode so that it could be extracted. In Leon, near the modern city of Ponferrada, is a geographic feature called Las Medulas. At first glance, it resembles a collection of eroded volcanic dikes, but it is in fact the remains of the largest open-pit mine in the Roman Empire. Roman engineers, having determined that the mountain contained large veins of gold ore, set about cutting channels and tunnels over and through the mountain. Once the tunnels had been completed, 5 aqueducts brought water from higher ground all around the site, channeled into the tunnels and over the mountain's surface, and washed most of the mountain away. I've posted images on the Instagram page, and it is really amazing. Pliny the Elder was a procurator in the area at one point in his career, and described the technique, calling it ruina montium, the wrecking of mountains. He also noted the horrible lot of the slaves who actually did the work, those who dug the tunnels, living for months without seeing the sun. Slavery in the mines was, in a very real sense, a fate worse than death, though more often than not, it was that too. According to Pliny, the mine produced 20,000 Roman pounds of gold every year, and at today's prices that would be about $500 million annually. The mine was active for about 250 years until it was finally exhausted and abandoned sometime around the turn of the 4th century. Similar techniques, by the way, were used on a smaller scale all over the empire, with an especially notable one being in Wales. Besides the mineral products, Hispania produced plenty of agricultural products for export that filled the purses of the elite. Hispanian wine was produced in quantities both to satisfy the local market and to export to Italy at several different price points. Salted fish and garum also filled the holds of ships bound westward, but probably the most important cash crop for Iberia throughout was olive oil. Olive oil was the oil of its day. It was used in food, of course, but also in lamps, as a skin treatment, in perfume, in medicine. Olives and olive oil were produced all over the peninsula, but the olives of Baetica, the southernmost of the provinces, were especially well regarded. Olive oil was made in industrial quantities and shipped to Rome in large clay amphorae. The sheer size of the city at its height meant that it could never be fully supplied by its own hinterland, and required massive import networks just to stay functional. And that brings me to the second of those fun facts that you cannot wait to share with as many people as possible once you learn it. Turns out ancient economics is fascinating. Liquid goods coming to Rome were shipped, as I said, in ceramic amphorae, which are essentially giant clay vials. And once they were emptied, they weren't good for much, so they were broken and dumped. In Rome, just inside the Aurelian walls at the south end of the old city, there is a hill called Monte Testaccio, which is a landfill made almost entirely of these smashed pottery vessels, most of them deposited before 200 CE. Today, its base covers a little under 5 acres, and it stands 115 feet, or 35 meters, tall. It was probably bigger in ancient times, and that's impressive enough. But to make it relevant for our current discussion, analysis suggests that of those millions of amphorae, 80% of them contained olive oil from Baetica. A river of greenish gold flowed across the sea from Iberia to Italy, and the families that owned the olive groves became massively, massively rich. All throughout the Roman Empire's history, agricultural production was steadily consolidated into large properties that could produce crops on a commercial scale, mostly worked by slaves. Olive oil and wine especially favored larger producers since they both required equipment, storage space, and other capital outlay, and startup costs that were much easier for the already wealthy. Smaller farmers found themselves unable to compete and were gradually forced to abandon their holdings or sell them to the wealthier neighbors. From there, they had three basic choices. They could join the army, though as we've seen, this option became less and less viable or attractive as the military's makeup transitioned to primarily Germanic mercenaries. Farmers might look to be hired by those wealthy landowners, though as I said, most agricultural labor was done by slaves, and there were few paying jobs available. The only other real option was to immigrate to the cities and hope to find work there. And this happened across the empire, but especially in those regions like Hispania with heavy commercial farming. The feedback loop is pretty obvious. The rapid growth of the cities placed massive demand on the countryside to feed and supply them, enriching the landowners and enabling them to continue expanding their holdings, which in turn continued to drive immigration to those cities. These trends were ongoing throughout the history of the empire, increasing inequality across the board. Learned aristocrats continuously bemoaned the demise of the simple farmer-soldier on whom the old republic's greatness had been built, while simultaneously managing their estates in such a way as to make it impossible for those citizen soldiers to exist. The backbone of these large estates were the villas. Today we think of these as luxurious country houses, like Hadrian's famous villa at Tivoli, but it is a mistake to think of a villa as a rural equivalent of a townhouse. Villas were engines of agricultural production. The main house may be luxurious with all the amenities that a senator would expect, but it was surrounded by the quarters for slaves and overseers who worked the fields and storage buildings for their produce. They were businesses, and they were run like businesses. Archaeology shows what amounts to small towns clustered around the villas, housing the owner's employees and dependents, along with livestock and equipment. There are villas all over Spain, with particular concentrations right where you would expect them, in the wine and olive-producing plains of Andalusia, formerly known as Baetica. Wealth and peace meant that when senators contemplated retirement, Hispania was at the top of the list of many who sought a quiet life, and many already had estates in the area. The looming chaos would thus come as an especially nasty shock. The first sign of trouble arose from that habitual pastime of late Roman generals, civil war. The barbarian invasions across the Rhine in 406, along with the Emperor Honorius's apparently insufficient response, led the men of the field army in Britain to acclaim their commander as Emperor Constantine III. He led his army across the Channel into Gaul to deal with the situation. He was at least partially successful, but was unable to expel the barbarians from Gaul. As emperor, though, he wielded power over Gaul and Hispania, and after an unsuccessful attempt to dislodge him, Honorius was forced to recognize Constantine III as co-emperor. Hispanian nobles, probably at the instigation of Honorius, or of his magister militum Stilicho, rose up against Constantine's rule, and he sent a general named Gerontius to quash the rebellion. Gerontius was successful, but he betrayed Constantine and set up his own candidate as emperor. Sources here are divided about what happened next. Either Gerontius was distracted by the civil conflicts and left the Pyrenean passes open, or Gerontius actively invited the armies of Vandals, Alans, and Suevi roaming Gaul to come and support his rebellion against Constantine. Regardless, the barbarians crossed into Hispania in 409, either on September 28th or October 12th. The sources are divided on the date, but everyone agrees that it definitely was a Tuesday. These bands reached a working agreement to fight for Gerontius against Constantine, and at the same time rebellions in Britannia and northern Gaul reduced Constantine's realm to just central and southern Gaul and left him vulnerable. Gerontius crossed back into Gaul with his barbarian troops, met Constantine's son in battle and killed him, and then marched on Constantine's capital at Arles. At the same time, Honorius had named Constantius his new magister militum, and he was also advancing on Arles. A large part of Gerontius's force deserted him and joined Constantius. He returned to Hispania and committed suicide. That left the barbarian armies that had formed the core of Gerontius's army without a commander or patron, and so they were forced to make their own arrangements.
And in this case, as we have seen them do many times, that meant roaming the countryside, taking what they needed by coercion and force from the local population. It's important to remember, I think, that this kind of expropriation was just as much an act of desperation on the part of the raiders as it was a hardship to the raidees. While they were organized as military entities, these barbarian armies in the migration period were complete communities, with wives, children, and elders included, and all needing support. While there were probably folks who enjoyed the violence for the violence's sake, most, ultimately, were seeking the means to feed their families. That's a powerful motivator to seek a stable situation, and random banditry is not sustainable in the long term. We've seen all of this before, of course, with Alaric and his Visigoths, for instance, and that meant that the local elites of Hispania had their own bargaining chip to set against the barbarians' violence. Gradually, the groups found themselves places in the landscape, many of them ultimately making themselves the de facto political power brokers, or at least major players. These original barbarians, so to speak, came from four main groups: the Suevi, the Alans, and the two clans of Vandals, the Sealingi and the Hasdingi. The Suevi made themselves masters of Galicia in a kingdom that would last nearly 100 years, and which we will talk about next episode. The Vandals and Alans, meanwhile, made deals with the local power structures. Essentially, they ran protection rackets that kept everyone fed, but did nothing at all to ease resentments of the locals who saw their hard-earned produce, or potentially exportable trade goods, disappear into barbarian stomachs. Sources are extremely sketchy about how all of this played out or the exact relationships between the various tribes and local authorities. They are universally agreed, though, that none of it was good for the general population. Hydatius wrote that the barbarians who had entered into the Spanish lands engaged in plundering and hostile slaughter. Pestilence played its part no less effectively. And the next year, while the barbarians raged through the Spanish lands and the evil pestilence was no less vicious, the tyrannical exactor plundered the wealth and substance found in the cities and exhausted the soldiers. A horrible famine took hold, such that human flesh was devoured by the human race because of the intensity of the famine. That's 2 episodes in a row with references to cannibalism. Sorry about that. This semi-anarchy continued for years, with the arrival of the Visigoths in the northeast only contributing to the chaos. The Visigoths initially were firmly in the underdog position, as they had been just forced to evacuate Italy and were penned up in Barcelona under Vandal siege. But their fortunes were reversed in 416. Constantius, having seen off Constantine III and another usurper called Jovinus, recruited the Visigoths as allies in his efforts to reassert Roman dominion of Hispania. With Roman material and possibly naval support, the Visigoths exploded out of the northeast and fought a series of campaigns against the Alans, Vandals, and Suevi. The Sealingi and Alans suffered heavy defeats, and the Suevi lost at least one king, though their kingdom remained up there in the northwest. The Hasdingi, meanwhile, under the leadership of a king named Guntheric, may have actually fought as Roman allies, which would explain their emergence as the dominant Vandal band. After 3 years of conflict, Constantius ordered the Visigoths to halt their campaigns and withdraw back to Gaul, where, as we all know, they were granted permanent residence in Aquitaine. Constantius may have worried that the Visigoths would make themselves too powerful to control in Hispania, or he may have believed that the other tribes were sufficiently suppressed, and that the Visigoths would be more useful in controlling Bagaudae revolts in Gaul. He didn't seek the final elimination of the Vandals at all, because he probably wanted to keep them around as potential Federate troops, just with a clear idea of who was really in charge. It may have ultimately been a combination of all 3 factors. By 418, there seems to have been a Roman governor again, as well as an official field army in Hispania. None of the barbarian groups had been exterminated, and Constantius seems to have been perfectly content to have them available as recruiting pools, as long as they were slotted into the imperial apparatus. The major change that had been wrought by the war was the breaking of independent Sealingi, Vandal, and Alan power, and those bands were absorbed into the protection of other tribes, some to the Suevi in the northwest, some placing themselves under the protection of the Hasdingi Vandals. The Alans offered to recognize the Hasdin king, Gunderic, as their king, and the union of Vandal and Alan was achieved, that would endure all the way until Belisarius' African War. This moment of peace didn't last long. By 422, Gunderic was fighting the Suevic kingdom for territory in Lusitania. He was successful, and before long the Vandals were once again a threat to the Roman order in Hispania. The details of all the various battles he fought against the Romans and their Gothic and sometimes Suevic auxiliaries are unimportant right now. But 2 points are worth pointing out. First, according to Hydadeus again, in the course of the fighting, Gunderic sacked Cartagena and twice sacked Seville. Siegecraft had come well within their competency. Second, this period is when the Vandals discovered boats, launching amphibious raids on the Balearic Islands and the coasts of Mauritania. And if you remember, in just a few years, Vandal pirates will have the whole Mediterranean by the short and curlies. I'm resisting the urge to make a Manscaped joke right here. But at the moment, the Roman authorities were bringing in Visigothic auxiliaries to once again force the Vandals into subservience, and the pressure was building. Gunderic died suddenly in 428, to be succeeded by his half-brother Gaiseric, with whom, of course, we are all already familiar. Gaiseric must have already been planning for his next move, because it was just a year later when he gathered up all the Vandals and Alans who would follow him, acquired boats, and crossed the straits over to Africa. The departure of the Vandals opened up space for the remaining powers to fight over. Initially, the winners were the Suevi in Galicia, who rapidly pushed their influence southward into Lusitania. For a time, they set up their capital at Merida, but that would be the greatest extent of their kingdom. The expansion was halted in 452, when an agreement was reached with Valentinian III. Nothing specific is known about this agreement other than it left pretty much the entire west of Hispania under the military authority of the Suevi. We'll talk more about them in the next episode, as I said, since I've been largely ignoring them, and it's high time that they got their due. Meanwhile, the imperial relationship with the Visigoths carried on under the Visigoth king Theodoric II, as the Visigoths were given responsibility for maintaining authority in southern Gaul, based in Toulouse, as we know. That relationship would continue, though contentiously, as we've heard already, before reaching a true breaking point under the leadership of Theodoric's successor, brother, and murderer, King Euric. The two great powers of southwestern Europe were now the Suevi and the Visigoths, both under the nominal umbrella of the Roman Empire, but both accruing greater and greater independence and ambition. Meanwhile, a range of small-time Hispano-Roman warlords staked their own claims to the gray areas of Hispania. The struggle over control for the riches of Iberia will pick up there in our next episode. So, since we've got an idea of what we're starting with, let's take a look at our historical sources for all of it. We should all be used to me saying that the written record is spotty, but I'm going to say it again. The written record is spotty. 3 chroniclers constitute the core of the historical record, starting with Hydadeus, moving on to John of Biclaro, and then Isidore of Seville. Between the 3 of them, we have a relatively close-up coverage from the early 5th century through around 624, as well as a kind of nice progression of a society and region gradually working its way out of crisis. Hydadeus is the earliest source, and I've mentioned him already. He was born sometime around 400 in Galicia and served as bishop of what is now Chaves in Portugal. His chronicle is largely a record of contemporary events, which is great, though he did not have the up-close and personal perspective of Procopius. He's similar to Geoffrey of Tours. Hydadeus' episcopal position meant that he had to deal directly with the changing power structures around him, including the Suevic kings who ruled Galicia. Some scholars have noted that his chronicle is idiosyncratic, strongly personal, and closely observed, but not immune from error. Hydadeus is assumed to have died around 468 or 469, since his chronicle abruptly stops right then. Hydadeus clearly saw the barbarian invasions and occupations as signs of the coming end time, and we can trace the crumbling of Hispano-Roman culture through his work. A century later, John of Biclaro, the Bishop of Gerona, began his own chronicle as a continuation of the work of an African chronicler named Victor of Tununa. John was a Catholic bishop, but of noble Visigothic birth, which put him at odds with the Arian king Leovigild in his early career. His chronicle covers a relatively short span, from where Victor left off in 567 to 590, but those years happened to coincide with the official conversion of the Visigothic state from Arianism to Catholicism, and so it's highly valued. Lastly, we come to Isidore, Bishop of Seville, whose life could be an episode all by itself, and maybe will be at some point. Respected across Christendom for his writings, Isidore undertook the first effort by a Christian scholar to collect and present all the world's knowledge in a single summa, called the Etymologiae. I'm not saying that right, I'm positive. Etymologiae. Screw it. Which also sought to place that knowledge in a Christian context. His work was copied and distributed throughout medieval Europe, popularizing the use of punctuation marks in the process, long after his death in 636. He was a little bit like a Christian Pliny the Elder, and like Pliny, transmitted a bunch of scientific and medical ideas that seemed deliberately made to be hilarious to modern readers. For our historical purposes, though, we can be grateful to him for his Historia de Regibus Gothorum, Vandalorum, and Suevorum, which draws from a wide variety of sources for the history of those three peoples, including Hydadeus and John, along with other names familiar to us, like Orosius and St. Jerome. In those cases, he provides a useful summa of previous historians' work, and between 590 and 620, his work is the only available primary source for the Iberian Peninsula. Isidore's work was very much part of an intellectual flowering that occurred in the Visigothic realms in the 7th century, and indeed these three historians provide a framework for the development of post-Roman civilization in Hispania, from Hydadeus's doomsday gloom through to a belief in a bright Christian consensus, for that is where we are headed. Chaos followed by consolidation and the development of a new political entity unified by a single church. We'll be dealing with the first half of that dichotomy in this series, up to the Visigoths' final rejection of Arianism. And if you had told the Hispano-Romans living at the beginning of the 5th century that that's where things were headed, it would have probably seemed like a cruel joke. For most of this opening series of episodes will be in the hands of Hydadeus as he watches the world that once had been slowly collapse in front of him. And we will start with the Suevi. Thank you all again for listening. It's good to be back in front of the microphone talking to all of you. Please keep the reviews and comments coming. I've fallen way behind on answering emails, but please send them and I will try and catch up. And if you want to support the show financially, well, you can always head over to ko-fi.com/darkagespod. That should be back up and running to leave a one-time donation. Or you can also, of course, head over to manscaped.com and use the promo code DARKAGES at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. Thank you all again. Until next time, take care.